Hey, it's Concrete. A surprising amount of people wanted to see a video on Vape Train's Arabica Coffee, so we're going to spin that into an entire coffee video. I've got their Arabica Coffee, I've got their Ice Coffee, I've got their Coffee Milk Froth, and I've got their Coffee Liqueur. I've vaped them all, and now I'm going to say some words about them. I did not pay for any of these concentrates. They were all provided to me by Vape Train, so thank you, Vape Train. First for today, I have Vape Train's Arabica Coffee. With coffee flavors being hard, why not go straight for like the hardest of them all to nail, which is a decent black coffee. I feel like this does a lot of things fairly well. And again, you're talking about competition to other coffee concentrates. The actual base of the coffee here, so Arabica is just a type of coffee bean. Apparently it's one of the more robust varieties, which is pretty good because this is a fairly robust coffee taste. The coffee here feels a little overbrewed. It feels a lot like percolator style coffee or like gas station coffee where they've just thrown way too much hot water at it. It's a little bitter, a little astringent, but it does sort of get across that black coffee, like that classic black coffee taste fairly well. While this isn't exactly the most nuanced coffee note, the one thing it does really well, for me at least, is it sort of minimizes some of the off notes that are associated with more realistic coffee flavors. A lot of the darker coffee flavors have a very prominent burnt popcorn kind of skunky note to them, and while I do feel like a little bit of that is present here, it's definitely not as prominent as some of the other coffee concentrates you could use. I think Flavor Art's Dark Bean is kind of my basis of comparison for just like a straight dark coffee concentrate. If Dark Bean is like an 8 out of 10 for those like skunky burnt notes, this is more like a 3 or 4, so it actually represents a good deal of progress there. You do get like that clear, sort of bitter, dark, hammered coffee note, but you don't get a whole bunch of accompanying baggage with it. I have found that if you take this up a little bit higher, you maybe start to get a little bit of nuance to the coffee, but it's not necessarily all good nuance. It gets a little biscuity when those like buttery roasted notes come in, and then there maybe is just like a little bit of like a tart fruitiness to it, but it tastes a little sour, honestly, as opposed to just tasting like a cool fruity accent to your coffee beans. I think overall this is one of your more workable dark coffee options if you're trying to avoid those off notes. Used low and definitely under 1%, probably more like 0.5%, maybe even 0.25%. It's kind of a thin flavor, but if you think about it, that style of coffee is kind of a thin flavor too. You're not looking at a whole bunch of body, you're just looking at that kind of like bitter coffee note to it. Kind of works about like you'd expect there. The cool thing is that it tends to like stay in place too. I've tried a little bit of mixing with this and it just kind of stays as like a thin layer of coffee flavor. It doesn't dominate the entire thing. Overall though, I feel like this is probably one of the more workable black coffee concentrates I've came across. Doesn't sound like a whole lot to say, hey, this isn't terrible, but really with coffee, it's definitely a step in the right direction. Next, I have Vape Train's Ice Coffee. I'm just going to cut to the chase here. This one's a little weird. So I'm glad they used ice and not iced, because this doesn't just feel like a generic coffee with a cooling added to it. The actual base coffee here tastes really similar to that Arabica. I don't know if it's the cooling or what, but it also seems like it's quite a bit less strong than the Arabica, but you're talking about the same kind of flavor profile. You're talking about those like darker, almost bitter burnt notes, relatively low skunkiness. It just feels very familiar. The ice part of this is a little bit more confusing though. So you'd assume they just go for neutral cooling, right? Coolada, maybe if they're trying to be neat, use some WS-23, whatever. I think this uses some kind of weird variation of menthol. It feels fairly similar to what's going on with the Vape Train Sorbet base, where that again would have like been better with the neutral cooling. It has a little bit of mintiness to it. It's kind of a sweet spearmint flavor, and it's not super cold either. It feels vaguely equivalent to like 0.25% Coolada or something. It's just, there isn't a whole bunch of like deep cooling there. It's just like a little bit of a sweet spearmint, vaguely cold edge to that coffee flavor. I'm not sure if it is something different about the coffee or just having that coffee note up next to a mint, but I also feel like this is getting a little bit chocolatey on me. You're kind of getting like a thin mint effect without any of the actual corresponding like bakery notes. It's a little odd. The chocolate here isn't bad. Definitely tastes like kind of like cocoa, darker cocoa kind of note, and it works well with the other things here. It doesn't taste bad next to that like darker coffee note. It doesn't taste bad next to the mint or whatever. It just kind of makes finding a profile for this sort of interesting. You can joke about like, if you can't find a use for a concentrate, just put it with the tobacco, but I do actually think that that would be a pretty good use for this. I could also see maybe using this with something like Flavours Chocolate Deutsch to kind of add some interesting coffee and mint notes to it. I don't think it would taste bad. You could also just add some cream to kind of bulk it up a little bit and kind of skate on that coffee and that chocolate and the mint. But it's going to be a little bit weird looking for a place to mix this. It does work okay by itself though. Since that coffee here feels a little bit more forgiving, I feel like you can crank the percentage up a little bit more, especially if you're going to be using it like as a primary flavor. I feel like 3% isn't overbearing. I did try this up at 4% too, and right around 4% you start to get like some of those skunky notes and those buttery biscuit notes. So I'd probably keep it a little bit lower than that. But yeah, 3%, throw some cream in it, see what happens. It's an okay flavor. It's not unpleasant, but I have no clue what to do with it. Next, I have Vape Train's Coffee Milk Froth. Again, this one's a little bit on the interesting side. I do get a coffee here. It's not like a super strong coffee, and while it does feel similar to the Arabica, it's noticeably weaker. I would venture to say we're talking like a quarter as strong or something like that. Same kind of hammered black coffee note, but I do feel like the off notes show up a little bit more in this one. The actual milk froth is interesting. So with a milk froth, right, you'd want like, this is fluffy. That's what happens when you froth the milk for like a coffee drink. Like it adds some volume and some texture, and I'm not really getting that out of it. It also doesn't feel like a steamed milk, which is a little darker, a little sweeter, a little maltier. This feels super buttery. It's like coffee and really, really heavy cream. While I do feel like it's a accurate dairy note overall, it's just something about the way the coffee is playing with that buttery note from the cream. It's not entirely pleasant. The coffee's sort of light enough, and the skunkier notes are kind of picking up the buttery notes from the cream. Kind of has like a coffee breath effect, but also with some butter in your mouth. I know there's weirdos out there that are into their bulletproof coffee and stuff, but for me at least, like butter and artificial coffee flavor aren't necessarily two great tastes that taste great together, and it's jarring. In a somewhat novel turn for a coffee vape, I don't feel like the coffee is really the limiting factor here. I think for me, it's more that butter, you know, that level of richness versus that coffee note. I'd probably top out with this around 3%. I feel like anything over 3% is getting like super overwhelming. Where you'd use this, you could maybe work it into something like a coffee ice cream. You know, that would probably give you a place to put a lot of those buttery notes, especially if you bulked it out with another cream. I also feel like this would be a good match for like a softer caramel flavor, just because you could kind of hide those burnt notes in with the caramel to make the caramel darker. The butter wouldn't be out of place, so you could make like some sort of frou-frou caramel macchiato kind of vape out of this, but it's going to be a little bit difficult to work around. Last for today, I have Vape Train's Coffee Liqueur. So I was super excited for this one. As we've seen, normal coffee flavors have some very serious limitations. They have a bunch of off notes. I think the Arabica does a slightly better job of managing them than some of the other ones. But it's tricky to get a coffee profile to work. So what would happen if you took like a Kahlua flavor and just used a blessedly artificial coffee flavor to try to impart some of that to your mix without having to mess with the off notes? This is good, but it's a little tricky. I feel like there's a whole lot going on here. So just right off the bat, I really do like vaping this by itself. The coffee note isn't the coffee note from Arabica. It doesn't have that kind of like heavy, burnt, buttery kind of edge to it, as like relatively workable as that is in Arabica. This kind of takes a different tack. I don't get a ton of like very strong identifiable coffee. It does sort of hew towards that coffee liqueur kind of vibe, where it's mostly just a dark caramely kind of sweetness with a little bit of like dark coffee accent to it. It isn't particularly accurate to anything like an actual brewed cup of coffee, but it does capture that pretty well. I think it's pretty realistic and on profile. I also think that there's a lot of chocolate in here. And again, I don't think that's necessarily wrong for the profile, but it kind of stamps on my dream of using this as a coffee flavor that doesn't suck. The chocolate here feels a lot like TPA's Double Chocolate Clear. It's that same sort of general genre of thinner, almost kind of boozy chocolate flavor. It feels a little artificial, maybe even a little bit waxy. I don't think that is a thing that necessarily takes it off profile, though. Like, I feel like that note is also super present in, like, Kahlua or other coffee liqueurs, so I think it's realistic in that way. It just makes mixing with this a little confusing. Mixing with this, it reminds me a lot of some of the Irish cream flavors, specifically Flavours Irish cream, because I feel like that does have some of those kind of chocolatey notes. So it seems like it'd go really well with something like tobacco or cream, and it does. It works really well. Tastes really good overall, but you do get a good amount of that chocolate. Like, anything that I mix this with has brought out those chocolatey notes a little bit more. Without that stronger coffee note to it, I do feel like the percentage here is a little bit more flexible. It actually feels a little thin and underdeveloped to me, like underneath 5 or 6%. You don't really get a whole bunch of the sweetness that you want from like a coffee liqueur profile. 2-3% probably be good as an accent and add some of those like chocolatey coffee kind of notes. So overall, like, I'm happy with this flavor. Like, it tastes good. It's just not what I was hoping it was going to be. Overall, interesting batch of flavors. Next video is going to be more Vape Train viewer's choice. I'll try to actually stick more to the script that time, but did want to say, if you want to check out the more detailed flavor notes, you are more than welcome to at my super professional website, tasteofconcrete.com. Thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I will catch you later. For me here, I think the limiting factor is going to be that butter. Oh, no, now I'm tasting it.